Morning, church. I hope you're well on this sunny holiday weekend. Today, we get the joy of continuing in our study of the life of Joseph, a true story, which is found in the Bible at maybe the last 25% of the book of Genesis, the last quarter of the first book of the Bible. Today, we're going to turn another corner in our study of Joseph. We've talked about Joseph and his mistreatment by his family growing up. We've talked about his brother's evil hatred of him and the consequences there. We've talked about him being sold as a slave into Egypt. We've talked about his years in prison. We've talked about the time when his brothers show up for the first time and he's confronted by the pains of the past. We've talked about how his brothers had been living with years of guilt. We've talked about his father and the years of grief that his father has been living through. At this point in our study, Joseph is basically 40 years old. 40 years old. Can you imagine living that long? I mean, wow. 40. Whoa. So he's basically 40 years old, and he's been working in Egypt now for at least 7 years through years of prosperity, gathering things. And at this point, we're in our study, it's the second year of the famine. So he was 30 when he came into Pharaoh's service, plus 7, plus 2. He's 39 at minimum, 40, 41 max. He's right there in that zone. Now, this is taking place, I just want to remind you, the brothers and his father, they're coming into this story with a little bit more than 20 years of pain. 20 years of he's not seen his father for 20 years, a little bit more than 20 years, the guilt that his brothers carry. This has been going on for a couple decades. And then finally, after all this time, after all these experiences, after all this tragedy, after all this pain, this great messed up family, for all these different reasons and all these different angles, finally transitions. They transition into an extraordinary season of healing, of happiness. After all this time, this family transitions into some amazing days. After these years of pain, this time of suffering comes to an end. And they together just enter in a season of grace and goodness. Now, I'm sure many of you know a bit about what that's like. Maybe you've had some seasons of suffering. Maybe you're in one now. Maybe you will be someday. Seasons of confusion. Seasons where you look ahead and you're not really sure how anything is going to work out right. And maybe times where you're struggling to see hope for you and for your future. Those are hard days. I get it. Those are hard days. And I tell you what, be encouraged by Joseph's story. Because today, Jacob, who is his father, Jacob and none of his 11 brothers could have possibly ever seen this coming. The moment that they're about to experience, the revelation that Joseph is alive, that he's leading Egypt, and all that's about to happen, they could not see this coming. They were not seeing this coming. And I'm just reminded that no matter what we can see coming in our days, with our eyes, there's always hope. There's always hope. Now, I know most of you live with a vague sense of hope, or maybe a strong sense of hope for a better future, and maybe you have some crummy things going on in your life, or maybe a few crummy things going on in your life, and praise God if that's your situation. All that to say, no matter your situation or your season, I believe that there's better. I mean, Joseph is in an extraordinary season of his life in this moment, and yet for him, it's about to get even better. It's about to get even better. He's as successful as anyone on the planet, basically, on that day. And yet for him, he's able to take even another step during this season. Anyway, so that's what's happening here as we're setting up our story. Joseph and his family are moving from decades of pain or wherever they're coming from into a season of unexpected grace and goodness, where things unfold in such an amazing way that they wouldn't believe it. Even if they were told, it would just be too hard to believe. It's just amazing days here. So our focus today is going to be on this wonderful transition. on this transition from decades of hard to decades of goodness. And as I've looked over this story in advance, because I study in advance before standing up here, as I looked over this study and this transition, there's going to be some pieces here that I want to identify and highlight as we go through the story, because I want to set you up well. If you ever find yourself on the door of moving to a better time, a better season, I want to set you up well, and there's some pretty standard pieces in here that I think will set you up well to move into better days and a better season. I don't know exactly what your story is like, but I do believe that better is very possible for you in the days ahead. That I think that you're going to be, as you're attentive to these pieces that we're going to talk about today, that God can bring you into, like a Psalm 23 is a psalm that I like to hold on to. Maybe for you it's a peaceful streams, green pastures, quiet waters, that kind of season in your life, or maybe it's just a season of rescuing, being lifted out of a miry pit, Psalm 40, out of the mire and clay, and depending on wherever your story is. I believe in hope. I believe that because we have a living and active God, there's hope for all of us in all of our situations. Okay, so let's look at the Joseph story. I'm in chapters 44 and 45 of the book of Genesis. And basically here, Joseph has been pestering his brothers intentionally. Now, that's a very mild way of saying he's been terrifying them. He's been terrifying them and tormenting them, setting them up to look guilty. They have no idea that this is their brother setting them up. It's hilarious as long as you're not them. And thus far, they've come down for food. They've met Joseph. They don't know it's Joseph. He calls them spies. He leaves Simeon in prison. They go back. He says, don't come back without your brother. Benjamin, they're just terrified. He leaves the food in their bags, so they get back, and they didn't pay for all the food that they took from Egypt, and so they're freaking out. They're just a mess as a family, full of terror and fear. And then ultimately, they have to come back because there is just no more food. They bring Benjamin with them, and again, Joseph sends them home after a bit of a feast and hides his cup in Benjamin's bag, or has somebody do that. Then he sends his soldiers after them, his people after them, and Benjamin is accused of stealing Joseph's cup. He's just setting them up. This is just fun brother stuff, right? And then they all come back terrified that their youngest brother is now a slave in Egypt, and their father is going to die of grief because of it. So they get back to Joseph's house, and Joseph is just like, what in the world? You stole my cup? That's not cool. And that's a loose translation. And then Judah gets up and he speaks. Now, Judah is the one. Judah's the guy who championed the selling of Joseph into slavery. Okay, he's that guy, just remember. He's done this, and he starts speaking, and in Genesis chapter 44, verse 16, this is what I read Judah saying, okay? He says this, he says, what can we say to my Lord? I mean, they have the cup. Benjamin's busted here. What can we say to my Lord? Judah replied. How can we plead? How can we justify ourselves? We're just stuck here. God has exposed your servant's iniquity. We are now my Lord's slaves, both we and the one in whose possessions the cup was found. This idea of God has exposed our guilt. Maybe we're not guilty of this moment, but God has exposed our past guilt. God is repaying us for the evils that we have done. They sold Joseph into slavery, and now they're all slaves. Judah does not miss it. He gets it. They sold their brother into slavery in Egypt. Now they're all slaves in Egypt, okay? You know, I love the honesty here. They just get to the bottom, and they're broken. Many times, guys, many times before moving out of a season of darkness, there's a needed change towards honesty. There's just a needed change towards owning up to what's going on and what you've been about in the past. A needed change towards humility. Towards humility and confession. These guys have held this secret for decades, over 20 years of not owning up to this one, okay? And then they start verbally confessing their guilt. They're being honest about the wrongs that they have done. And not just honest in their heart before God, but honest to people and just being honest about it. Ruler of Egypt, yeah, God has exposed our guilt. God has exposed our past guilt. Friends, if you want to be ready to transition into better days, and I want better days for all of you. All of you. If you want to be ready to transition, then cultivate this practice. Number one, practice humble and honest confession to people. Just a transparent life. A humble, transparent life. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. He lifts them up in the proper time. He's looking, those who are proud and are concealing and are saying, I'm fine. He opposes that, but he gives grace to those who are just humble. I am not perfect. I've messed up. And here, this is exactly what we're seeing with Judah. Judah has had it rough. Remember, his sons have died. He has 2 of his sons have died. His family is totally messed up over these last 20 years here. And yet he brings into real humility. You know, my dad, I have the highest opinion of my dad. I really love him, and I hope he's watching this right now. No, he's sleeping. Say time zones away. But no, I have the highest opinion of my dad, and I just think he's amazing. But a couple decades ago, he had to go through a humble transition. A humble transition in life, because he had a hard upbringing. He had a difficult life, and God did an extraordinary changing work in his life, and he got to this moment where he's just like, you know what, I'm not perfect, and he owned his past, and he's just been very humble and open about it for these last several decades. And God, after that was able to take place, God was able to use that humility to bring him into a season of better and a season of good. But that didn't start until he was just like, hey, I'm not going to hide this. I'm not going to hide the pains of my upbringing and stuff. And he was able to just be honest about it. And God was able to bring him into a season of grace and goodness, which he's still in. And I just really appreciate watching God's work throughout the whole course of my dad's life. If you want to move forward, into a season of God-given grace and goodness, expect that transition to begin with honesty. Again, expect that transition to be just publicly owning, I am not perfect. I know you're not perfect. I just don't know how. I'm not perfect. None of us are perfect. And I hope that you can come to peace with that. That we're pursuing Jesus together. We're praising him for his work of forgiveness to ourselves, to us, and his cleansing of our imperfection. And so, if you want to move into that season, God often waits for our humility and our owning and our confessing. You think about revivals in the past, revivals on this island, revivals around the world. They're so often marked and even initiated and begun by public confession of sin. Where God just brings conviction. People are just like, okay, I'm guilty. And just confessing of that sin, just cultivating this environment for a hunger for holiness and just that fear of the Lord and that humility. And when God's people humble themselves and pray, ultimately turn from their evil ways, then God seems to move. So that confession of sins, the addressing of the past, it's one of those main pieces. I think many people get stuck in prolonged, difficult seasons because they blame others. They blame others for their situation. They get in a cycle of blame as opposed to humility. They're not honest with themselves about their part, and so maybe they get stuck in bitterness. And they get really bitter about someone maybe who's hurt them or whatever. And they blame and they get stuck in unforgiveness. And they just get trapped there in this poisonous, bitter place. I can think of people that I knew growing up who have become stuck in that sort of place. You don't get to move forward really into the season of goodness and grace until that poison is pulled out. Until that bitterness, until you forgive and you confess your part and you own that part. Now that doesn't get you there to the season of goodness all the time, but it sets the table. It sets the table to be able to move into those better days. Okay, so that's confession. Is one piece usually present when moving from a hard season to a season of grace. Basically, for the rest of chapter 44, Judah is owning it. He is pouring out his heart to this person who's Joseph, but he doesn't know it. And he's saying, look, our father, this is the most devastating thing. And he's basically saying, we've been guilty. God has found us out. God is repaying us. We're guilty. Have mercy, have mercy, have mercy. And then this is how Joseph responds to this appeal, starting in chapter 45, verse 1. We read this. It says, Joseph could no longer keep his composure in front of all his attendants. So he called out, "Send everyone away from me." No one was with him when he revealed his identity to his brothers. But he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and also Pharaoh's household heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But they could not answer him because they were terrified in his presence. They were terrified in his presence. This is the moment. This is that moment of revelation where all of a sudden, oh no, it's worse than we ever thought, or it's better than we ever thought, but it feels like it's worse right now than we ever thought. They're terrified at this moment. They're just terrified. Very often, friends, when you are at a moment on a doorstep of major transition and change, sometimes it is very, very scary, and you don't know what's about to happen. Terrifying, not always, but sometimes it's all good stuff, but sometimes it's downright scary. Maybe it's scary because you have to face the past like these guys do. They have to face the past. And if you've ever thought ahead and you're like, oh man, someday I might have to face my past here and what I've done to that person or whatever, it can be a terrifying thought and past. Maybe it's scary because people have, maybe you have hopes. Maybe you have hopes for something to happen. You're like, I don't know if this is going to happen. I don't know if it's going to fall apart. It's either going to fall apart or fall together. I just don't know. And that can be really terrifying. Transition moments are usually full of some uncertainty, where you don't know how things are going to end up, and you can worry and you can just be terrified and afraid. Usually in seasons of transition, there are elements of faith-anchored courage needed, and that's number 2. Cultivate faith-anchored courage. Faith-anchored courage. Every major transition in my life has required faith-anchored courage to navigate. The last time our church needed a church building, we searched and searched and searched, and things just weren't happening right. For years, before we moved into here, we were meeting in another church that direction. We were really having a difficult time with the leadership of that church. We'd negotiated some things that, we were like, we'll pay you 50% more rent if we can have this and this and this. And they're like, sure. And so they started taking our money but not giving us what we had asked for. And months were going by and it was irritating. We were feeling stuck and nothing was happening. And it was an uncomfortable time. And then this building here became possible. I don't want to give away the story, but we ended up buying it. Anyways, so this building became possible, and we began praying and seeking God, and it was a really internally conflicting time because there's so much hope and there's so much worry. What if my hope gets dashed? What if things fall apart? What if this doesn't come together? And we prayed and we fasted and we sought God together. What if it didn't happen? But the thing was, God knew what he was doing. He was in the process of answering years of prayer. He was in the process of bringing our church into an extraordinary season. Out of a difficult season and into a season of grace and goodness. But there was uncertainty. There was worries and fears. And in those days, I made a heart choice. A heart choice. And I said to myself, Brian, let's not waste this season being afraid. Let's not waste when it just might be one of the most amazing seasons of your life. How many people waste the most amazing transition moments in their life by just living afraid? And I was like, let's not give way to fear here. Maybe God is about to give you exactly what you've been praying for these years and bring you in this church into a season of grace and goodness. Don't waste this transition in fear. Instead, dig into a faith-anchored courage. Friends, there are going to be scary days ahead. There's going to be scary days ahead, and very likely, if God's going to bring you into a different season, even if it's a better season, there can be scary and uncertain aspects of it all. I encourage you not to give way to fear. Not to give way, not to let fear rule your heart and your mind. You're going to live in misery when God's giving you a glorious gift. How sad is that, right? Living miserable when God is being as actively good to you as you ever dreamed. It's amazing. I've personally tried to live my life with some faith-anchored courage and hope, meaning that if I ever feel like I'm on that edge of transition, I'm not going to live those. I'm going to choose to not live those days in fear as much as I can and choose courage, because I don't want to live through the amazing days and miss out in the joy of them all. I want to live those days thankful and excited about what God's doing. I hope that makes sense. Joseph's brothers are about to enter into an extraordinary phase. They are right on the doorstep. In fact, in this very hour, things are going to start changing for the good. God has spent over 20 years setting this up for this moment. Now think about that. God has spent 20 years, over 20 years, setting this up for this moment. And now this moment has finally come, and they don't know what's about to happen, but God's been preparing this great future for this family. Just say, choose courage in life. Reject fear, just in general. Choose to believe that God's paying attention, that God is with you, and that God will help you. I want you to be ready. I want you to be ready to transition into better days. Cultivate a courageous, believing heart that says no to fear and yes to courage. Okay, so in times of transition, there's confession, and then there's a need for courage, and then what do we read in the next few verses here? Chapter 45, picking up in verse 4. The story continues, Then Joseph said to his brothers, Please come near me. And they came near. I am Joseph, your brother, he said, the one you sold into Egypt. In case you forgot who Joseph was, Just remember, yeah, that was awkward, right? The one you sold into Egypt, and now don't be worried or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there will be 5 more years without plowing or harvesting. God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land. By the way, just tipping back to those of you who have been a part of this study for a long time, without plowing or harvesting. It's really clear here. They couldn't even plow the land, let alone harvest the land. Why? We talked about the floods just not going down, so they couldn't actually put this stuff in the ground. Anyways, that's just there. God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, Lord of his entire household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Okay, so the point that I keep seeing through here has to do with number 3. Seek to understand God's why. Seek to understand God's why. Friends, learning to understand the big picture, what is going on in your life? What is God doing in your life? Where is God taking you with your life? What is your life about? Understanding God's purposes for your life, both for now and for the big picture and for always, that's a huge deal when it comes to being able to navigate seasons of transition and change. Don't you think Joseph spent a lot of time as a slave thinking, God, why am I a slave? Or as in prison, why am I a prisoner? Did it have to be prison? There's probably other ways, right? We could have gotten from here to there. You got why this unfair treatment? Why do I keep feeling successful and then everything being taken away from me? Why, God? Why? And Joseph discovers that there's reasons. And sometimes we don't like the reasons, or maybe we feel like there could have been other ways we could have gotten there or whatever. But there are reasons. Now, many people in the Bible are asking God, why? God, why are you allowing evil to take place? Habakkuk. Why is this happening to me? Job. There's just tons of examples in the Bible. People going, why? And seeking God's why. Why for what's going on in their life. And the Bible has loads of answers For why? In my Bible read through group this week, we were in 2 Corinthians, and in chapter 1, why is God permitting suffering with these believers? Well, 2 Corinthians chapter 1, you can read all about why God permitted suffering. There's a lot of answers to some of these big why questions in our life. It's not a mystery. God wants us to know that he has good things in store. One of the ways that you can prepare yourself for seasons to transition into better days is to understand why. Why has God made you? Why has God placed you? Like for Joseph, for instance, why suffering? Well, why did he have to live through 13 years of suffering? Well, he says in verse 5, the suffering was so that I could be here to preserve life. I can tell you why I went through that season, to preserve life. If you're living through a season of suffering and you're asking God why, sometimes maybe it's because you've messed up and God is disciplining those he loves because he loves you and he's trying to bring you back into obedience. There was somebody who came into the church, I think it's probably a couple years ago now, visited just one time, and probably the reason why only one time is because of this conversation that we had. And this person was just like saying, I've just been in this painful season of my life and spilled this big story of basically just running away from God and total rebellion and all that sort of stuff, choosing not to follow God's path for their life and the pain and falling apart. And I was like, okay, well, great. Not great. I didn't say great. I was like, okay, the path back, okay, repent, own it, repent, and turn back to God's way. Move back to obedience. I didn't see her again, ever. But that direction, God calling that person giving that opportunity for a life to return to obedience. Sometimes we suffer because we're in rebellion to God. But other times I talk to people here who stay around and they're suffering because they're stuck in a place. It's not their fault. Things have been happening to them. It's resulting in sin of another person, and they're waiting on God to rescue them. And they're waiting, and why are they suffering? And they're asking, why is God not acting quickly? And we just encourage them here to hold on because God is a rescuer, and He's going to use this season of waiting for future ministry. He's going to use this season of suffering to encourage others who are going through suffering. Again, that's 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Why suffering? Why isn't God acting quickly? Well, he's going to redeem this. Trust him. And he's going to act. Trust him. Joseph understands the reason for his suffering was to get him to a place where he could preserve life. But not everybody suffers like that, and not every one of us are in places like that at all. Some people have heaps of success in life. Just heaps and heaps of success. And that's also true of Joseph here. Like I said, for the last 9 or more years, nobody in all of the planet has had more success than Joseph over this 9-year period. From slave to I'm Pharaoh's father, okay? That's kind of a big change. That's a big transition. He has had heaps of success. He has had more success than anyone in the world. Okay? In seasons of transition, you might be asking yourself, why have I had so much success in my life? And you're like, God, if I have to choose between those two, that's the one I want to struggle with. God, why have you given me so much success? Again, my father, he was financially fortunate in all his decisions throughout his life, and I've heard him ask himself, why me? And it's a good why question. God, why have you chosen to bless me? And he's looking at his life. He's like, I don't deserve this. It's not because of my righteousness. God's just blessed me. Why have you blessed me? And he believes that so much of his financial success is because God was setting up to be generous in his future. Generous to Scotland, generous to God's work around the world, generous to his local church. That God was providing to him so that he could provide for kingdom stuff around the world. And so he asked himself, why has God allowed things why has God blessed me in this way? Oh, the reason is to be about financing his future, to his kingdom in ways. He's wrestled with that from that point of view. Why is Joseph successful? Joseph is successful. In verse 7 it says, to keep people alive by great deliverance. I've been positioned here and I've been successful for the purpose of keeping people alive. What is God's purpose for you? Do you know why God has made you the way he's made you? Why he's blessing you the way he's blessing? Why he's leading you through dark valleys or peaceful streams? Do you know why? What is his desire? Why do you live here? Why are you here today? Why were you raised where you were raised? Why are you a part of this generation? Why do you have these opportunities that God's given you, maybe with education or just the friends that you have in life? What are God's purposes for your life? Let me just say this. Joseph, think about this. Joseph, if Joseph didn't understand why, he could have made some really messed up decisions here. If he didn't understand that God had him there to preserve life and to protect his family, he could have really messed up his family. If he could have just gotten, he said, I'm here, I'm going to take revenge. But because he knew the why, he was able to navigate it right. It is well worth spending lots of time seeking God on, God, what is the big picture purpose for my life or this season that I'm going through? I encourage you to be seeking God in that. He does answer those questions all through the Bible. And I believe that if you seek him, he will answer those for you. Okay, so there's one more thing that I see in this moment of transition. I'm going to keep reading here in verse 9. So he just told them what they already knew, that he is ruler over all the land of Egypt. Verse 9, return quickly to my father, Joseph says, and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me without delay. You can settle in the land of Goshen and be near me, you, your children and grandchildren, your sheep, your bring the whole clan, right? Your sheep, your cattle, all that you have. There I will sustain you, for there will be 5 more years of famine. Otherwise, you, your household, and everything you have will become destitute. Look, your eyes and my brother Benjamin, your eyes and my brother Benjamin's eyes can see that it is I, Joseph, who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all my glory in Egypt and about all you have seen, and bring my father here quickly. Then Joseph threw his arms around Benjamin and wept, and Benjamin wept on his shoulder. Joseph kissed each of his brothers as he wept, and afterwards his brothers talked with him. They wept, they talked, they believed the story, and I'm sure that this was a whole lot of information for them to process in a short amount of time, but they received forgiveness. They received forgiveness from the one that they'd hurt, and they received grace. Number 4 here talks about experiencing the healing and joy of a better season. Guys, there are times when the pain of the past just gets forgotten by the joy of the new era of goodness that God brings you in. It's not that you forget it, but you forget it, and the stings and the pains that you feel like are just you're never gonna they get just washed away by the goodness of God. The goodness of God. This is the first moment for Joseph's brothers. And we'll read more in the weeks ahead, but the moment where the whole family's dark years are starting to be swept away, and they're able to cry and receive grace and mercy. Friends, it is amazing when you get to those days that you hope for. It's amazing when you get to those days that you pray for, those days that you long for, those days where you get to see with your eyes and experience just those days of goodness and grace. Those days that maybe seem impossible or seem like a long shot, those days that you hope for, and maybe they seem a long ways right now, but family, I believe those days can come for you. The day is coming when God will give us more space as a church. The day is coming when God will answer our prayers that we've been praying and give us more space. I don't know exactly when, I don't know exactly how, I don't know exactly where, and that doesn't bother me too much. I mean, sure, I'd like to know that and all that sort of stuff. Love to have all those answers. I know we all would like to have all the answers all the time. But our future day will come as a church, and it'll be amazing. And the day we hope for and we pray for, someday we're going to gather together and that first time in our new facility, and just like it describes in Psalm 126, our mouths will be filled with laughter, with joyful singing. We'll be declaring that God has done great things for us, and we are filled with joy, and people will agree. Our future day is coming. I have zero doubts about that. Zero doubts about that. And individually, as individuals, I believe God has future days of goodness and grace possible for you and coming for your future. Days where you get to step into better. When hard days will come to an end, and days of goodness and grace will be your reality. And I believe that God will rescue those who need rescue, those who cry out to him day and night. He will bless those who grab a hold of and understand God's purposes for their existence, God's purposes for their life. Just encourage you to prepare yourself. Spend this time preparing yourself for better days, cultivating humility. Cultivating, confessing what needs to be confessed, forgiving what needs to be forgiven. Prepare yourself by cultivating courage instead of letting fear just run wild in your life. Grabbing a hold of that, rebuking that fear, and holding on to courage. Also preparing yourself by seeking to understand God's purposes and plans for your life. These things will set you up well for when your day comes. May it be soon. Hopefully it's not a significant wait. It might be. Sometimes it doesn't happen in this life, but only in the life to come. And we trust God with all of that. But as long as you breathe, I have hope for you. I have hope for you in your future, and I pray better days ahead for all of us. May God see you. May God help you understand the whys of your life and bring us all into better days swiftly and quickly. I've got 3 challenges for us today. Challenge number 1 is simply this. Is there anyone you've sinned against that you still need to seek their forgiveness on? Kind of a Judah moment. Is there some confession you need to do? I encourage you to do that right away. You're like, no, that's terrifying. Okay, do it anyways. Number 2, if fear is dominating your heart, get prayer. Go for prayer today and resolve to choose courage and hope. Thirdly, set aside time to pray and seek God, asking him to help you understand some of the whys of your life. I encourage you to sit down with a pen, with paper, with prayer, and prolonged time. With prolonged time. Just spend a lot of good time seeking God on that.